This is vlog 2 about my first interaction with Linda discussing her experiences in education and conversing about our differences, our similarities, and how her background and culture affected her education. So we first started off with talking about culture and how that structured her education and also affected it, or how that made how it shaped her experiences in her education. So when discussing Linda's experiences in her classroom, I began by prompting the conversation to how her everyday school life was like, from classes to dress code, school structure. I started more with visible culture because I knew that at the beginning of a conversation would be better for her understanding of how we were talking about how her culture affected her education. So I told her that in school I wore a uniform throughout high school, and she also did. We then discussed classes that they typically took. Linda explained that for language, they did not get to choose. They always learned English as their second language. They began from elementary school, and if you were to learn a different language, then you would be learning their own language, English, and the third language would be on top of that if you wanted to learn anything else like Spanish or anything else. They also did not get to choose their class schedules. There weren't any. We talked about how this contrasted with my experience in high school, where I got to choose a lot of my classes from a variety of electives besides our core classes, and including my language. I was allowed to choose, so I chose Japanese when I was younger and then Spanish when I was older. Whereas she said their core classes were what they took and they didn't get to choose. And my electives included more creative things, like I was able to take a textiles class and a woodwork class, things that were a little more practical and not a little more stress relieving. We began to discuss her lifestyle at school regarding class time and study time. She began classes at 7:30 a.m., and her day consisted of 7 to 8 classes, followed by a study hall from 7 to 10 p.m. at night. This meant that they stayed in dorms on their campus due to the late night, early morning requirements. And Linda emphasized that her 50-student classes had little discussion, no joking, as there was no time because of how much work they were required to get through. It was a very strict environment, and respect for the teachers was required. I noticed that as she spoke about her class time and study time, she was under an immense amount of pressure, time restraint, and workload. However, there was no question about that being expected of her, or that they would act in any other structure. Her intense schedule reflected the invisible aspect of her culture's value of education. It also showed the culture's learning styles, intense studying of big workloads, and an authoritarian classroom style where the teacher does majority of speaking and showing the work. Because we talked about how they didn't discuss a lot of what was going on. The teacher didn't have you turn to a partner and ever talk or have debates. It was the teacher put up the work on the board and then you did it. This furthermore showed their etiquette and a value of authority by strictly obeying teachers and showing only respect. I shared with her that my education experience was very different. I had 5 classes a day, 8:30 a.m. to 3:15 p.m. and I was required to participate in extracurricular activities. One of them had to be a sport, and one of them had to be more of a creative curricular. I took theater sports, and my classes were much smaller, 25 to 30 students, but all mixed around each period. Whereas Linda said she stayed with the same 50 students for every single class, and instead of them moving around to each different classrooms or different parts of the school, the teacher was the one that moved around and moved into the classroom and then would leave, and then the teacher would come in, etc. While I had much work to get through, as well as discussion between peers, class, and teacher was encouraged. It was how we got through all of our work. It was most of the class times now in college, and as long as it's not a lecture, obviously, now in college, but in high school, most of my time was spent discussing with other students and discussing with the teacher our learning objectives. Many times these discussions would turn entertaining. I frequently joked with my teachers as we had comfortable relationships. While teachers always had respect, it was returned. Therefore, I felt I had a better relationship of comfortability was able to be reached. From Linda and I's conversation surrounding our education experiences and how they are affected by culture, I noticed many differences. While both of our cultures clearly had the same value of education, they reached this very differently. Many of our invisible aspects altered how our schools and education are structured. I felt my culture valued creativity and freedom within our education a lot more relationship-based and reflected through our less intense workload, our options through choosing subjects or our future. This clearly meant our learning style allowed for less instruction and more work based off our capabilities. This contrasted with the Chinese culture, which valued education, but their learning style was much more rigid. I believe this is to instill the value of hard work and make sure that the cultural norm of attending university after school remains. However, the differences in our cultures, learning strategies, both our cultures value education for its benefit, for future work or university, and that was very clear through our conversation. We then went on to metacognition and learning strategies. I was able to, I gave Linda a background of metacognition so she could understand what I was getting at. So we taught, I explained that metacognition awareness would be of her strengths and her weaknesses and what her habits were. I used different prompts to start this discussion, such as when we discussed in class, we talked about how if a friend was mad at you, what are your strengths when you're in this situation, what are your weaknesses, and what do you normally do? And so that kind of gave her an understanding of what I was getting at and where I was trying to go with this in her education style. And I also talked about it and how I would have responded in that situation. So I noticed when discussing metacognition and learning strategies, Linda and I had a lot in common, which I felt was really interesting because of our different school structure. Linda said when she was in high school, she understood that to do well, she would need to have good time management skills and not get distracted, which is clearly shown through their structure by having the kids have a study session and live on campus during the week and things like that. We discussed her metacognitive knowledge and analyzed her study habits. Well, I analyzed her study habits, but we just discussed it. And she said she was good at asking the teacher for help. However, a big weakness was if she didn't like the teacher, she wouldn't do as well in the class. And I felt it was interesting that she was good at asking a teacher for help because of that very, that authority that they held would seem intimidating for me. Whereas for her, it was just, that was the way a student-teacher relationship was. We started talking about how she improved her learning, and I take the same steps, which is putting away her phone when she's studying or in class, out of sight, out of mind, and handwriting notes for better comprehension and practice, which I expected because, it's known worldwide that is proven to improve your learning rather than typing. Outside of the classroom, I told her I need a very controlled and specific space with I like a certain lighting and a certain amount of noise, but she said she didn't really care. She felt it was due to her strong study habits. She said while she was writing an essay, she would need complete silence, but other than that, she listened to music and she could be in a loud area and study and it wouldn't bother her, reinforced by how focused they can be when they're studying. In China, the learning strategies were much more strict in high school, and I felt that resembled college, including like the required study hours, a lot of homework and exams to practice and test their understanding, living in dorms to emphasize focus on school. It's proven that if you live on campus, you are more likely to do better in your classes. So you can see where China brings that into their education, but a lot earlier than American culture. This was emphasized through also having rules inside the dorms. They have lights out times, they have point systems to watch behavior, whether it was behavior in your classroom or behavior in the dorms or behavior during study hall, and there were punishments. This contrasted to the learning strategies emphasized in my culture. It is a lot more independent. We had periodic assignments, tests too, to keep us on track, but nothing holding us to required studying. You got out what you put in, and no one was holding you to it, really, is what I felt. Until I got to college, I feel like I cleaned up my act a lot more, and I learned how to study when I got here. Whereas when me and Linda were talking, she said her structure made it so much easier for her to come to university because she was already enforcing those study habits that they bring in once you're come to Michigan State. The competition between students is common, whether for grades or behavior in China. However, it was highly discouraged in my culture due to insecurity and seen as embarrassing students, which in my culture, in the culture I did high school in, was seen to have the opposite effect. Rather than encouraging the students and wanting them to compete with each other, it was thought of as, well, I'm not as good as them and I won't be. So that was what teachers felt it was. So that was an interesting learning strategy, I thought. Linda said that when the teacher ranked and announced students' grades in class, it encouraged her a lot to do better because you wouldn't want to be embarrassed the next time that they put up the list of who did best and what they did, because after an exam they would put a list in the hallway and number every single person, and they had an exam at the in the middle of the year and at the end of the year. And then also when they did tests in class, the teacher would read out around like the first 30 students ranked. And when she told me that, it helped her. I started telling her that once when a teacher had done this in my classroom, it had hurt my feelings and I felt less motivated, and actually argued with my teacher about this situation, saying that I felt embarrassed and that wasn't what school was about, was to humiliate me and tell the class our grades because they were lower than everyone else's. That was just seen as a taboo in my high school. Overall, the biggest difference I could see between our cultures was the strict emphasis and required learning strategies that occurred in China. I think it connects to the Chinese culture value of education, because it seems, me and Linda were discussing that if you don't complete your education in China, you're not going to be as successful. Therefore, if you don't go to college, you will be a failure, is what we talked about. And I think, while I do think there is a stigma in our culture that if you don't go to college, you won't do as well, I do think there is a lot more, it is becoming a lot more accepted that if you do have a different route, whether it's a blue collar, you're getting your associate's degree, or you're doing something totally else, it's okay, and you're still seen as being successful. And I think the value of education is so strong in China. They begin to structure students to be ready for studying at a much earlier age. Whereas, like I said, and me and Linda discussed, I felt a lot more lost when I came into college, and is still taking me time to figure out time management and figure out studying and planning, because I'd never had this workload or even anything close to this workload. And because of that more creative and freedom that I had in my education, I feel like I didn't have as rigid of a schedule, and I still don't schedule myself that way. So that was me and Linda's first interaction, discussing our experiences in education and how they contrasted between her, the Chinese culture now and when she was in high school, and the culture where I completed high school in, and our learning experiences and education experiences now in college. Thank you.